Hello and welcome, students. This is the ongoing discussion of our textbook. We're going to resume our discussion of World War II in the Pacific. So make sure you've watched 7.1 Part 1. That obviously precedes this, which we'll call 7.1 Part 2, even though we'll also include 7.2 in this video because it's such a small chapter. And like before, we'll jump uh, I'll have I'll share my screen right now. In fact, get it going. We'll have the text up on screen so you don't have to look at me. All right. And here we are. We are on page 202, and we're discussing the short term or long term. Where are we here? Short term causes leading up to Japan's involvement in the Pacific War and America's involvement, of course, as well. Okay, ready? Let's go. The Sino-Japanese War and U.S. reaction. Okay, so we know a lot about the Second Sino-Japanese War. We've talked about it a lot in our paper one book. I'm not going to go too much into detail. Basically, it mentions the assassination of one of the prime ministers, Okado, which happened in 1936. Uh, they tried to take over the government by assassinating the prime minister. It failed. It says the coup failed. The takeover attempt did not work, and some of the people responsible were executed. It says this incident, however, had the strange consequence of causing, I'm right in here, okay, uh, the military to tighten its control of the government, which helped ensure that military solutions to foreign policy's issue would take precedence over diplomatic answers. So the military is increasingly in charge, especially by 1936. And anything that happens is going to be looked at from a military perspective more so than a diplomatic, how can we all get along perspective. Okay? This ascendance, rise of the military to ever greater political control prompted the Japanese to pressure the Chinese government for more concessions. They wanted more stuff from China. When Nanjing, the seat of the government of China at the time, refused further concessions, not confessions, a dispute on the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing was used as a pretext for a full invasion. And we know a lot about the Marco Polo Bridge. It happened in July of 1937, and we know that there was troops on both sides. We're not really sure who shot first. It's not that important. In this case, it wasn't a fake incident like Mukden. It was a real military engagement. Of course, they could have withheld and talked it out, but they used that as the excuse to invade. Uh, Jiang Jieshi is in charge, Chiang Kai-shek of the nationalists of the Chinese government at the time. He is no match for the well-trained and well-supplied Japanese military forces. Uh, and it said the Japanese army made short work of the forces in China. That he had to escape the city and leave, and they killed quarter of a million, 250,000 civilians in the weeks after the city fell. Uh, Within a year, the Japanese army had captured much of the Chinese coast and close to its entire northeast. This aggression clearly threatened U.S. interests in the region, and they extended loans to Jiang's government. So the U.S. are now supporting Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, or the Chinese government in charge against the Japanese at this point, because they want China to remain open as a trading port. They don't want it to be taken over by the Japanese. U.S. businesses also traded oil and steel with the Japanese, so they're kind of playing both sides here, which the invaders ate up in larger and larger quantities. So those are two of the major things that Japan is getting from America: oil, which they don't have at all in Japan, and steel, which you need to make boats and planes and a lot of other things they're going to use in the war. Okay. Eventually, the war with China would cost the Japanese government over $5 million a day. Now, I don't know if that's $5 million a day in 1940s money or in modern day money. Either way, it's a lot of money. Okay. This dependence on U.S. resources would prove to be a serious and strategic liability. Okay. One that would propel the Japanese government to war with the US. So that's a big sentence down here you should highlight. Okay. It's a liability, something that makes you potentially put in a sense of danger, right? It's a liability to Japan to be so dependent on America. So if America is going to cut off those resources, which we know they do, then Japan has to take action. How are they going to deal with that? Being told what to do, for instance, because we're going to get to it in a minute. There was negotiations, and really I mean, America wasn't asking Japan to not do certain things. They just wanted them to leave China. They didn't say you couldn't. I don't know. They weren't telling them to. I don't even think they were mentioning Manchukuo in that. They just wanted them to leave China in the whole note, which we'll get to soon. And of course, Japan refused. Okay, so the Japan, it says in the last paragraph, knew that they needed to expand in order to keep what they had. This would threaten the British, the Dutch, and the US, who all had holdings in that region in southeast China. Any resources the Japanese could take from the region would be threatened on their journey back to the home islands by the US protectorate in the Philippines. So as they moved back from under China, let's just pull up a map here that we can just have handy. So let's share here. Uh, Google Earth. All right. This will pull up fairly quickly. No, did I click on it? There we go. All right. Hello. Okay, get started. No. All right. We just want to go somewhere. Search Google Earth. All right, China. We're not even going to put a city. We're just going to put China. See where it takes us. All right. So, okay. This city down here, I believe, is Shanghai. I could be wrong. Let's be more specific than China. Let's go Shanghai. Shanghai, China. Oh, I'm way off. Okay. Shanghai is way up here. Okay. So, okay. Oh yeah, because it's at the mouth of this massive river. Oh, come on. Go out, go out, go out. It's the biggest city and global financial hub. All right, there's Nanjing. We just saw it when it was there. Okay. Oh, this is still way too. Why is it so slow? China's big though, right? Hong Kong is down here-ish. So anyway, anything they got from this area, okay, this is of course Taiwan, and is Okinawa, as you know, and of course now we're here at Japan. Um, they had to get it back. So what they're saying is in that part, no, there we go. Nah, it's faster. Okay, using the mouse. Come on, Jace, you can do it. Okay, is the Philippines, if they needed to get anything from down here, the Dutch, Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, the French Indochina, Vietnam, or anything down here-ish, they kind of had to go by, through this area of water by the Philippines. And the Philippines was controlled by America at this time. And this area is even called the Philippine Sea. So they knew that they were going to have to, take over this at some point to ensure a stable flow of goods. And so that's what they're talking about there. Okay, we'll just leave that up, come back to it as we need it. That took way longer than I thought it would. I apologize. All right, here we go. War plans. Okay, so now we're down to war plans, bottom of 202. There is a competition between the branches of any military, and Japan's was no exception. So anytime you have these guys with a lot of testosterone who are flexing their muscles and saying, we're the best, we're going to defend the emperor the best, we're going to go out and take stuff for the emperor the best. You've got the Navy fighting the Army for supremacy. The Air Force is a limited new thing, so it's not as powerful back then. It's basically the Army and Navy. And the Army's reputation, it says here, had been sullied by the attempted coup of 1936. Sullied means made less honorable or made dirty. But it was still politically very powerful. The Navy, the most conservative branch, okay, the one that doesn't want to really take risks, but it was still politically very, no, no, sorry, it was never really taken to the rabid nationalism of the Army. So the Army was the ones who were really like hell bent on like, live for the emperor, die for the emperor type of thing. The Navy, not so much. All branches of the military want to demonstrate that it is more vital to the national interest and thus claim a greater influence and share in the distribution of resources. So if you can show that, you got to have boats, right? We're the Navy, you got to have ships, we're an island. We need more resources. Give us the steel. The Army's like, yeah, but once you get to the land, hey, it's the Army. We go in and we're the ones on the ground who are, fighting the other people and blah, blah, blah. So they're both trying to say, hey, look, we need the stuff. We're important. The Japanese Army thus argued for a solution that emphasized land operations against the Soviets. This plan, known as the North Program, was tested in the late summer of 1939. Okay, so just before the war starts in Poland in September, right, where Hitler invades Poland and starts the European part of World War II, when a Japanese division engaged a Soviet force under the command of Georgy Zhukov on the Mongolian border. Okay, so we're gonna we're gonna go back to this map here. All right. Okay, here's Mongolia. Now this is modern day boundaries, but I think it's okay. This is what back then would have been Manchukuo, okay? And Russia's up here, and this is Mongolia. So somewhere in here, they're going to have a battle between the Russians and the Japanese to test how much they can push the Russians because the Russians, uh, don't really have a lot of forces out here. They haven't entered the war yet in 1939. They're still not fighting because don't forget they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, and they didn't think they were going to have to fight the Germans. So that's going to take a little while before that kicks off. But they still don't have a lot of men and manpower out here. So we'll see how this plays out. I feel like I'm keep going back and forth here. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Did I hit record? Oh, I need to make sure I did. Yes, pause, stop recording. Okay. Because I'd hate to say all this stuff and learn that I hadn't hit that button. Okay, here we go again. Okay. So, at the very bottom of 202, the Japanese were overwhelmed by this battle with the Soviets and withdrew. They retreated. Okay, here I am. I'm right here at the top of 203. So no more North program. They're like, yep, no more of that. We'll go south. From that point, the South program, which would push the search for resources and hegemony into Indochina, was dominant. Hegemony means like total control of an area. The South program gave more strategic planning influence to the Navy. It would also likely clash with Western interests in the region. All right. Sorry, I'm trying not to burp. Then we get a little blue book, a little blue box. Sorry, the Tripartite Pact. The fall of France in June of 40. So now we're into the war in Europe. And the signing of the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany seemed to open the way for the expansion of Japanese influence into the French colony of Indochina, which again is modern day Vietnam. With her right flank protected by a non aggression pact with the Soviets, Japan had, by the summer of 1941, occupied the entire colony. Okay, and it tells you a little bit about the Tripartite Pact, signed in 40 between the three Axis powers, basically Germany, Italy, and Japan sign it. And they basically said that if they're attacked by any country not then at war, hey, who's that? That's America. It's they don't call it America in the pact, but it's clearly they're talking about the United States. That the other two will help the third one, um, defend itself. Okay. So it's just a clear signal that these three countries are kind of aligned in their goals for domination and expansion. And, they are going to be the Axis powers in the war. Okay, then we get to Pearl Harbor. And again, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on Pearl Harbor. We've talked about it in our Move to Global War book, but we'll see what this particular textbook has to say about it and just make a few comments. The months leading up to the attack on the U.S. naval base in the Hawaiian Islands was a flurry of diplomatic wrangling. Okay, wrangling means like trying to control things and get it to cooperate between the United States and Japan. The U.S. was determined that Chinese territorial integrity be restored and free trade be reopened. They were all worried about what Japan was doing in China. The Japanese were just as determined to not forfeit their recent gains, nor to have their strategic plans be subject to Western approval. They didn't want to lose face. They didn't want to seem like they were taking orders from the West. They wanted to assert their power as the dominant people in Asia. So they weren't going to back down. And they were a little insulted, by some of the demands from the United States during this time. Now, we've talked many times that in no way was the attack on Pearl Harbor a reaction to America turning off the oil. The oil embargo was the last sort of like action by the United States that led to the attacks, but in no way did Japan think that by attacking Pearl Harbor, the naval base where all the ships were in the Pacific Ocean for the United States, that America would go, "Oh gosh, well we better turn your oil back on." We know that that's not the case. We've talked about that a lot in class, so I hope I don't have to repeat that too many more times. But let's see that instead, the theory that we go by in our class is that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, A, to dismantle and disable the fleet, all the battleships and all the aircraft carriers. They were hoping to bomb them and sink them, and that would take America time to rebuild. And in that time, they would then dominate the Pacific. And then America would be like, all right, you're very dominant, Japan. We want to make peace so we can, have some balance again in this region of the world. Let's negotiate. And they thought they would come to the negotiating table with strength and say, look, we have this, this, and this. We'll give up this and this, but we don't want you to have this and this anymore. We want to keep this and this. Whatever they thought. They never thought for a moment that America would get quite so pissed off and react so strongly to the attack on one small base in Hawaii is not even a state of the United States yet. That doesn't happen to the 1950s. So it's really just a place that's occupied and protected by the United States, but it's not even a state. It's not like they attacked California, for instance. Okay. In July of 41, the Japanese army occupied all of Indochina. Okay. And Roosevelt learned through radio intercepts that the Japanese were developing military plans at the same time as they claimed to be negotiating in good faith. So he knew, you can't just send a whole bunch of ships halfway across the Pacific Ocean without planning it out. So the plans were in motion. Okay. Roosevelt ordered an embargo supported by the British and Dutch on all trade with Japan. So this is in July. Pearl Harbor takes place in December. This cut the Japanese military off from over 80% of its oil and much of its steel, and had the effect of putting the negotiating with the U.S. on the clock, it says in our book, which I think is an interesting phrase. So it's ticking, right? And there's a point at which some negotiations could have possibly worked, and the boats wouldn't have set sail for Pearl Harbor, and they would have maybe thought, okay, we'll do this instead. But that plan is in motion, and they needed to come up with a way to stop it, and they couldn't. So there was no turning back. Probably by the beginning, December 7th was the attack. I guess by the beginning of November, those boats were getting equipped and getting ready to set sail from Tokyo Harbor. Japan's oil reserves were low, and if war with the U.S. was coming, the faster the better, before fuel shortages made combat impossible. So the longer they waited to maybe attack the United States and use up a lot of oil, to fuel their boats and planes, the longer, the lower their resources were going to be. They were trying to find oil in the Dutch East Indies and other places, but they certainly weren't going to get as much as they had been getting from the United States. This was the view of the commander of the Japanese Imperial Navy and chief military planner. And here's a big name you should circle. It's right here, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Okay, he's obviously a major figure in the war. Yamamoto had studied in the U.S. and understood its awesome industrial strength and military potential. He spoke a little bit of English. We'll see him in a movie. He's portrayed fairly well by the actor. We're going to watch a movie called Midway. And the movie starts, even though it's about the Battle of Midway, it starts with the Battle of Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor. He hoped that his government could avoid a war with the United States. He didn't want to have a war with the U.S. because he knew that they wouldn't win. In the long term, they wouldn't win. In the event that such a war did come, he believed that the Japanese could be reasonably successful for 6 months to a year. So again, they were trying to buy time. Should the war continue beyond that, Yamamoto had little confidence that they could win. Okay. This formed an outline of Japanese strategic thinking in the fall of 1941. Should war be necessary, they would act quickly, expanding their empire's defensive perimeter from which they could negotiate from a position of strength. And that's what I was just talking about. They wanted to expand, take over things quickly, while America regrouped. Now, of course, we all know what happened at Pearl Harbor. Okay, I've made you say this out loud in class a lot of times. The attack went well for the Japanese, except, you tell me, they didn't get the aircraft carriers, right? These are some of the most important naval ships in a fleet. They're a new type of weapon in World War II, a long, huge boat that takes a lot of time to build, and it has a flat deck where planes can take off and land and attack other boats and land from that boat, aircraft carrier. America at that time had four, and they're all at Pearl Harbor, but they weren't there on December 7th. That Sunday morning, they were out on maneuvers, out at sea doing like a military exercise. So when the planes came in from the Japanese and they attacked, the aircraft carriers weren't there and thus did not get attacked. There was no real way the Japanese could have known that. It was just bad luck on the part of the Japanese from their perspective, good luck on the part of the American perspective. And they, of course, they did devastating damage to the rest of the fleet, and we'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Yamamoto was tasked with development of the attack plan. It would contain 3 assaults. The Japanese army would land and overpower the U.S. outpost on Guam and Wake. I've been to Guam. It's lovely, but it's tiny. You can drive across it in about 2 hours. A larger force would land in the Philippines. Okay, we talked about the strategic importance of the Philippines. The main focus of the operation was a surprise aerial attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. And this is part of the reason that people, the Americans got so upset, is that it was a surprise attack. Not that the Japanese went willy-nilly all around, I think Pearl Harbor, I should know this, I apologize. I think Pearl Harbor is on the island of Oahu. There's like five main islands. Some of them are bigger. It's not like they went all over Hawaii dropping bombs on civilians and blow. They attacked the military outpost at a naval base, and then they pretty much left. Now, did civilians die in that attack? Yes. But most of the people who died were sailors on board the ships that sunk, and people on they attacked the airfields and things like that. So it wasn't like they attacked uh, just random targets or carpet bombed Hawaii. Uh, but of course, the surprise nature of it was what incensed and made the American public so angry. Uh, Waves of torpedo and dive bombers would launch from aircraft carriers and had snuck across the Pacific. The goal was to damage the U.S. fleet to such an extent that it could not carry on operations in the Pacific, thereby giving Japan a free hand to consolidate its gains. They would just have no competition. No other boats would be interfering with their decision to attack here, there, and everywhere in the Pacific region. We're going to see a map coming up in a page or two. Surprise was vital for this operation. The ongoing negotiations in Washington and the U.S. Pacific Fleet's tradition of standing down on Sundays, if the attack was on a Sunday, gave the Japanese the confidence that this surprise could be achieved. Obviously, if the Americans knew they were coming, if they had announced the attack and said, "Hey, look, if you don't turn the oil back on, let's say, we're going to attack you on Sunday." They would have been ready. They would have moved the boats out of the harbor. They would have installed defenses. They had some stuff set up, but it was definitely they were taken by surprise. Okay, flip, final page here, 204. This is the sinking of one of the ships. I believe this is the Arizona, which is now the memorial ship. If you go to Pearl Harbor, you can visit it as a tourist destination. It's like a museum and a memorial. A memorial means a place you go to honor the people that have died in a war or a battle. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was indeed surprised. Over two-thirds of the available anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. It was a Sunday morning. Americans were at that time were very religious. A lot of them were probably either sleeping in if they had the day off or at church. They were not as fully staffed, I guess, with defenses as they would have normally been. There was precious little ammunition for anybody that was around. They weren't just ready for this type of attack. It took a little over an hour for two waves of bombers to sink four battleships. That's the second biggest boat in a navy next to the aircraft carriers, and heavily damaged three others. 12 other vessels of various sizes were also damaged, and 200 aircraft were destroyed. The planes were just kind of sitting out there on the runways to get maintenance, to get ready to fly off to do practice stuff. And so they were unguarded and, not covered, and they just bombed them and blew them up. Uh, by the end of the day, the U.S. had suffered 2,700 casualties, of which just over 2,000 were dead. So remember, casualty means hurt or killed. So in this sentence, they're telling you that at least 2,000 of those people hurt were actually fatalities. They died. While the damage caused by the raid was stunning, it was far from the unqualified success the Japanese needed it to be. Okay, and we know the reason. Here we go. Despite that was Despite what was hit during the raid, it is perhaps more significant to consider what was not hit on 7 December 1941. The U.S. aircraft carriers had not been in Pearl Harbor that morning, and their survival meant that the U.S. could regain the initiative in the Pacific in short order. The dockyards and huge oil tanks were not heavily damaged, ensuring that Pearl Harbor was still very much an operational base, able to fuel vessels and repair those that had been damaged. Yeah, they had these huge, you know, I mean, ginormous tanks of fuel, and for some reason the Japanese didn't bomb those and blow them up. Um, and other parts of the dockyard, with cranes and everything to work on the boats were unhurt or lightly damaged. And so America was able to sort of get going again very quickly after, obviously there's a lot of damage in the bay with all the sunk ships, etc. Indeed, is a testament to the industrial strength of the U.S. that of the four battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor that morning, two were raised, brought up from where they had sunk to the bottom, and repaired with 2.5 years. And they were back in service that quickly. Okay. So it says in the blue box there, what role did luck play in the events? So luck was on the side of the Japanese. Their surprise worked. They had good weather that day. Um, Very few planes could get up in the air on the American side to battle the torpedo bombers and the bombers that were coming in. So they really just could just come in and drop their bombs and torpedoes and then fly off again almost unscathed. Um, they had almost no, they had some anti-aircraft fire coming at them. And then the luck on the American side was that the four aircraft carriers weren't in the harbor that day. So luck played a part definitely in that battle. Okay, and let's just jump into the combatants section here, 7.2. That's the end of 7.1. Okay, and we'll review in class the long-term and the short-term causes. Who was fighting? How did the military potential of Japan and the Allied powers? Should I make this a little bigger? Let me make this a little bigger. All right. Okay. How did the military potential of Japan and the Allied powers compare in 1941? Now remember, 1941, the attack happens in December of 1941. America really doesn't get into the war, as it were, until 1942. Like I said, it takes a while to train people, it takes a while to assemble forces, all that kind of stuff, to send new boats out to Pearl from California, all this kind of stuff. What role did geography play in the relative strength of the combatants? What influence did the fact that Japan was fighting in one theater of war, they were only fighting in their backyard in Asia, and the Allied powers were fighting in multiple theaters? So America, like I said, many, many men went down to their enlistment office. Enlistment is when you join in the Army or join the Navy the next day, December 8th, that Monday, okay, and said, I want to serve. I'm going to go fight. And a lot of them thought they were going to go fight the Japanese, but of course, half of them, now that we're in the war, Roosevelt declares war on Germany as well, and half of them get sent to Europe to fight the Nazis. So, America's forces are not fully concentrated in the Pacific. But of course, we have, our population is much bigger than Japan's, and our industrial capacity is way bigger. And that's all going to come into play here. Okay. Some of the key concepts we're looking at are continuity, how things stayed the same, how they changed, and the significance of certain elements within both sides of who was fighting. Okay. All right. So the Allied forces, the Allied are the winners of the war, and they are, in the larger sense of the war, are Russia, France, Britain, and the United States. Of course, the Americans get help, like I said, in the Pacific from the Australians. There's British forces involved in fighting in Thailand and Burma. Uh, and some of those forces are people drafted into the British forces from India because India is controlled by the British at that time, etc. So we'll look at that here. In 1939, the Australian Navy was incredibly small, given the amount of coastline it had to defend. All right, and that just makes me, of course, as a social studies teacher, want to share my Google Earth here. Let's go down and have a look at Australia. Okay, now I gotta do this. So we're going down, we're going below the equator. Okay, this is all Indonesia. Here's Singapore. You guys just went there. Malaysia, like I said, some of the fighting would be over here in what's now called Myanmar, Burma. Okay, India is involved, Thailand. There's a road into China. And a bunch of the fierce fighting is down here in Papua New Guinea, at some of these small islands, like the Solomons. There's a big battle. The Coral Sea. Okay, there's a battle down here. Uh, so yeah, some of these are going to be important. The only place in Australia, here's Australia, that gets attacked by the Japanese the whole time during the war is there's one day here in Darwin, this city way up at the top north part of Australia. They get bombed by Japanese planes. And that's about it. They never come way down here to the big populated cities of Melbourne, Sydney, or Brisbane, or Adelaide, anywhere down here. But this is where the Americans are bringing in boats, dropping off supplies and stuff, and then, coming up here to fight in this kind of bottom part of the Pacific, where a lot of some of the big battles take place in 42 and 43. Okay, but Australia, what they're saying is, look, Australia is this like kind of a huge island, if you think of it that way. It's this massive place, but look at all this coastline it has. You would think it would have a big navy, and maybe they have a really big coast guard, like the people in charge of like making sure the coast is safe and helping boats and people that are close to the shore. But they didn't have a big navy back then. They still have a tiny population, even in modern day. I think the population of modern day Australia is like 40 million people, and considering how huge it is. But that's because, as many of you know that have been there, you can live out here on the coast, but all this red part in the middle is just a massive desert, and it's really very difficult to live out there. So the perimeter of all this land is livable, but a lot of this is uninhabitable. And so there's not a population down in Australia that you might think would be down in a place like that. Okay, hello again. Here we go. All right. So the Australian Navy was incredibly small given the amount of coastline it had to defend. Its largest vessels were six cruisers of varying sizes. The Army had a tiny permanent force of 3,000 men. That's incredibly small. And another 80,000 men who were in reserve with various levels of training. They'd gone out on the weekend, learned to fire a gun, learned how to march maybe, but they weren't seasoned soldiers by any stretch. Now, the Australians had taken part uh, very valiantly in World War One, and they suffered a huge loss at a battle in World War One that you guys know about called Gallipoli. And that was a lot of their cavalry, their mounted guys on horses. But there's really not going to be much use for cavalry in World War Two. The Air Force consisted of about 250 machines. By the end of the war, Australia's armed forces had grown to 1 million men. This force had served in all major theaters of war, suffering 50,000 casualties. So they sent Australians to Europe. They sent them to Thailand and and to parts of China to fight. And of course, they fought in the jungles with some of the American forces on the various islands as they moved toward Japan. Okay, so that's the Australians. The British forces in the Pacific theater initially were concentrated in India, Burma, and Singapore. They also had a garrison, a large amount of troops in Hong Kong, and other smaller holdings. Royal Navy assets were concentrated in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. So the boats in the Royal Navy were mostly over, of course, near England itself, near in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean Sea between Europe and Africa. These were vital supply lines for the British Isles. The bulk of the British forces defending Burma were actually made up of units of its Indian army. So these were men who were fighting for the British, but were actually born and raised in India. Eventually, some 30,000 strong, though poorly supported and trained. Only about 17,000 survived the retreat back to India. Like those troops defending Burma, the British garrison at Singapore was mostly made up of Indian Army units. Eventually, this force would number over 130,000. Of these, over 80,000 would be captured in Singapore after General Percival's surrender. So the Japanese came down and attacked Singapore, and he had to surrender. So now Japan had the thing they hate the most. They had all these prisoners they had to take care of and feed and put in somewhere and guard. Okay. Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist forces, as well as Mao Zedong's Communist Army, fought close to 2 million Japanese soldiers throughout the war. So they, of course, make the Second United Front. We know about that. Chiang Kai-shek's forces consisted of about 230,000 effective troops, with another 300 weak, under-equipped, and poorly led and trained divisions spread around the country. Okay, and we know a division can be anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 to 12,000 soldiers, depending. Mao's army grew to about 400,000 troops in both regular and guerrilla formations during the war. So the Chinese were actively fighting the Japanese, of course. So it wasn't just the Americans versus Japan, and Britain and Australia were also involved. Okay, and then it's going to tell you about the United States. The United States Army would deploy 20 divisions to Pacific operations during the war. The Marine Corps, okay, they're often the guys, like I said, who go in first on the ground, grew to six divisions and almost 500,000 men during the war and had its own Air Corps, its own pilots. The U.S. Pacific Fleet stood at three aircraft carriers, nine battleships, eight cruisers, and 40 destroyers in October of 1941. Now, that's before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yeah, I thought they had four aircraft carriers, so maybe they built one more before December, or maybe my number is wrong and then we only had three. But I thought we had four. By the end of the war, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had grown to 23 battleships, 65 cruisers, and 26 fleet carriers. So, as soon as the war, we knew we were in it, the factories in America started making ships, and they were very good at it. Okay, so the Americans, lots of resources. They were helped by the Australians, the British, and to some extent the Chinese, all attacking the Japanese. And here is the Japanese forces. When the Japanese army invaded China in 1937, okay, so 37, this is way before 1941, Second Sino-Japanese War, it had about 24 divisions and about 5,000 airplanes. Conscription, bringing men into the war, into the army, and indoctrination swelled this to 50 divisions by 1941. So it doubled its amount of troops in a few years. The Army and Navy combined had a bunch of squadrons. Each squadron had 12 to 24 airplanes. On the eve of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military had access to over 3 million men who had received various levels of training. By 1939, Japan was producing about 4,400 aircraft a year. So they knew that planes were vital to their attack and plans and boats, right? This was nearly twice as many as the US produced in the same period. The problem was that the Japanese aircraft industry had only increased marginally by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, whereas the United States was producing over 26,000 by 1941. So in other words, they were producing in 39, they were producing about 4,400. Let's say that number went up to 5,000, then 5,500. As soon as America gets into the war, they're producing five times that, 26,000 airplanes a year. Okay. Uh, Now, like I said, some of those planes are not going to Japan, to the Pacific. Some of them are being going off to fight in Europe and Africa. But still, it just shows you the amount of production capacity that America had. By the war's end, Japanese aircraft production had risen to 11,000 per year, so their number is going up. Okay, while the United States was pushing out close to 50,000 aircraft a year. So you can't, 11,000 versus 50,000. Who's going to win? And of course, America is sacrificing and rationing and doing things to help the war, but the Japanese are really suffering to produce. They're giving up everything they have. The peasants and the people in the agricultural sector, in the farms, in places like Shimane and Yamaguchi and Totori, to everything is going toward the war effort. They're not making any civilian goods at that point. They're basically living off of very little food because most of it's getting given to the troops, and everybody's working in factories to make things for the war. So it's a very different atmosphere. The differential is misleading, but only slightly, as U.S. aircraft production had to be divided between the various theaters in which the forces were fighting, whereas all the Japanese planes were obviously fighting in the Pacific. So that's something again to remember when you're looking at numbers. The Japanese forces were nonetheless spread thin throughout the war. The political influence of the army ensured that the war in China received the lion's share of reinforcement personnel and replacement equipment. By 1945, the Japanese army had 1.8 million men in China, but far fewer in any position to offer resistance to the Allied forces moving toward the home islands. So they were concentrating again in China, and not so much because they're the army and they're the ones who are sort of in charge. They're not giving as much to the Navy, and the Navy are the guys in the boats with the aircraft carriers, with the planes, trying to keep the Americans from advancing on Honshu and Kyushu. And of course, the very first big battle is the Battle of Okinawa and the Battle of Iwo Jima, for instance, in the outlying areas around the home islands. Okay, so that's it. Did Japan overreach its military capabilities? That's a good question, one we should talk about in class. So let me know what you think about that. These are good questions here in the blue boxes. Okay, the next video will be strategy and tactics. Okay, and I think there's our map that I was talking about. How big they got. This is 41 to 42, and it kind of tells you when they attacked various places. Okay, here is Oahu, where Pearl Harbor took place, Battle of Midway. And like I said, they got down close to Australia. Solomon Island, Guadalcanal is a big battle. Battle of the Coral Sea down here is a big one. Okay. They were talking about Singapore is here. Okay. So we'll look at that. Let's see how many pages this chapter is really quick. So it's not so many. So that'll be one video probably. And then 7.4 is the longer chapter. Probably two videos for that. Okay, so that's the end of 7.1 and 7.2. I hope these are helpful. Give me feedback, please. Let me know if these are worth my time. And if they are, we'll do another one soon. Okay, guys, see ya.